Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Good morning, and you're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar. Hope you're keeping safe and well, wherever you're joining us from today. The Signpost Series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network, and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. So today we're going to be talking about nitrogen, but from a slightly different angle. Nitrogen is an essential nutrient for plant growth, development and reproduction. However, recent policy emphasis on reducing our reliance on artificial nitrogen coupled with significant price rises have focused minds on more sustainable sources of nitrogen. And red clover is a plant that has the ability to capture or fix nitrogen from the air and feed it into the soil and surrounding plants. And today we're joined by Dr. James Humphreys, Principal Research Officer with Teagasc in Moore Park. And James is going to be talking to us today about managing red clover on dairy farms. Good morning, James. You're very welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody.
And good morning, Pat Murphy. You're joining us from County Wexford this morning. You're going to help us with questions afterwards. How are you today?
Great. Still stuck in County Wexford. I haven't been out of it in a while.
Well, hopefully with the relaxation or imminent relaxation of the restrictions, they might let you out for a few days. James, good morning, and you're welcome back to the Signpost webinar. This isn't your first time to join us, and maybe James, you could tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, in particular in Solohead Farm is probably the main focus of where you do your research in this area.
So what we've been working at in the last few years is look at low carbon dairy farming, and key question is how low can we reduce our carbon footprint? And we've had an awful lot of visitors to the farm over the last couple of years, despite the lockdown. And the big question that's coming up, farmers are stocked up on the grazing platform. They're making more use of their outblocks. And they're the kind of big questions, like how do you manage clover on a fairly heavily stocked grazing platform, maybe stocked at 3.5 cows per hectare, and then using the outblocks. And something we've been looking at is using red clover on the outblocks, because you can grow a very high yield of herbage for silage with no nitrogen fertilizer. And, looking down the line when there's going to be restrictions on the amount of fertilizer that we can use, the thinking is, and this is really coming from farmers, that if we 20% of the farm in the outblock, we could maybe put red clover in the outblock, use no nitrogen on it, and that will give us our 20% reduction. That's the kind of story in a simple nutshell.
Okay. So I know today's talk is the emphasis on dairy, but I imagine there are lessons here for all farming systems, potentially even including tillage farmers, if there's a route there for growing forage crops. So look, James, I think we'll get straight into the presentation. I know you have quite a few messages to share with us. So James, I'll hand over to you.
As I was saying, the topic is red clover, and why is there an interest in red clover? And as I was saying at the open day last year, it was the single biggest question that was coming up. And really, it's a case where we're seeing intensification on dairy farms, higher stocking rates on the grazing platform, great reliance on silage production from the outblocks, from outblocks that may have not been used as intensively in the past. There is a requirement to cut fertilizer nitrogen by 20% by the end of the decade. And I suppose the thinking is we can produce very high yields of silage on outblocks using red clover, which is a very high capacity to fix nitrogen, and cut our nitrogen fertilizer use on farms in that way. The big risk, of course, is that we don't have a lot of experience with red clover in this country. So it's a case of taking something on and not really knowing, farmers taking this on and not really knowing what they're going into or what they might be getting into. So the idea of this presentation really is to kind of lay out the pros and cons of red clover. So if we look at the history of it, as we're saying, there's not much experience of it in this country. I suppose it was traditionally used in mixed arable and grassland farms in England and Belgium and places like that, in more productive areas where you have a mix of grassland and arable farming, and where the cost of reseeding was partially covered by the arable crop. Because that's one of the things with red clover, it doesn't last that long, so there is a greater reseeding cost with it. And of course, if that can be factored into if you're growing a crop of potatoes or something, partially covers the cost because you have to be reseeding anyway. You have to be cultivating anyway. And it fits in as typically a kind of a fertility building part of a grass arable rotation. And I suppose that's why it's popular in organic farms, where red clover has a very large capacity to fix nitrogen, so it can build up fertility in the soils. Problems with it in the UK that emerged in the 70s and the 80s with sclerotinia, which is a fungal disease, and also stem eelworm, which is a nematode. And I think that's something that we need to be wary of. At the same time, in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, we saw a large-scale transition to chemical fertilizer nitrogen use and a move away from these legumes. I suppose, which kind of brought about a big reduction in its use in the UK and elsewhere. And more recently, then we've seen the emergence of stem eelworm as a problem in Denmark. Now, there's an interesting story here and a lesson for us as well, in that when you think about it, big increase in fertilizer and nitrogen use across Europe and Ireland during the 70s. Denmark, very free draining soils. Problems started to emerge with nitrate leaching into the Baltic Sea, causing dead zones within the Baltic Sea. And that really was the beginning of the nitrates directive. The first country to introduce the nitrates directive in Europe was Denmark, in the same way as we were the first country in Europe to introduce the smoking ban. And then the nitrates directive spread from Denmark to other countries, became European-wide or EU-wide. And the thinking in Denmark at that time in the early 90s was that if we're going to be, thinking from a dairy farmer point of view, is that if they were going to be restricted in terms of stocking rate and fertilizer nitrogen use, they may as well go organic. So I think up to 20% of their dairy farmers went organic to get the higher milk price, started making greater use of clover, red clover in particular, and then stem eelworm then re-emerged as a problem. And I think there's a lesson in that for us if red clover is to become more popular. But, there are things that we need to be concerned about, but it's not something that's insurmountable, that these diseases can be controlled by a 4-year break between crops. And I think we need to factor that into our thinking when we're thinking about red clover. We also have new cultivars that are bred for resistance to these diseases. So, there's scope for hope on that front as well. And the thing about, say, Denmark, for example, like 19% of their land is used for grass arable type farming, and only 10% of their land area is used for permanent grassland, whereas the situation in Ireland is the exact opposite. 90% of our land is under permanent grassland. So we don't really know how prevalent these diseases are likely to become under Irish conditions, because stem eelworm, for example, is a common disease of many different arable crops. And if we encounter it in this country, it's more likely in relation to potatoes or something like that. Also, sclerotinia can be a disease of other crops like peas and beans. And in terms of identification, with the stem eelworm, it's a nematode, it's microscopic, you can't see it. And I suppose really what happens is you get a stunting of the crop. You can see the damage caused by the eelworm in the stem, but really the internode links are shortened, and you end up with these stunted crops here relative to the typical crop. And I suppose that's the key identifier, that your crop is stunted. The problem with stem eelworm. In terms of sclerotinia, they say that I have no direct experience of these, of course, but you end up with open patches in the crop. Also, you see this white mole growing on the stem. It should be green, like the one here or here. And if you crack open the stem, you'll find these black fungal growths inside the stem, which is kind of clearly indicative of the disease, along with the white mold. And I
James, sorry to interrupt you there. There's a few people just wondering, could we improve the sound quality? I suspect your microphone is from your laptop is selected. I was wondering, could you maybe go up to the mute button there, there's a little arrow beside that, and you can select up the top of your screen. I'd say you'll probably see the mute button. If a little arrow beside that, you can select which microphone is being used.
Is that better?
Not sure if it's noticed much of a difference there. It's the headset you've selected, is it?
Headset earphones, yeah.
Okay, all right.
It might be just a headset. Microphone is a good bit away from your mouth. Just
might bend it in a little bit.
Or will I switch to the other system?
That sounds better.
That sounds fine. Okay, thanks, James.
Okay. I hope that's better. And I suppose the last thing I'd say about that is that there's very low incidence of these diseases on Irish farms at present, on grassland farms. So it's not something that we're likely to see in the near future. But it wouldn't be something that would put me off at the present time. So in terms of a SWOT analysis then, try to weigh up the pros and cons of red clover. Very high fixation rates, in excess of 200 kilos per hectare, so we can lower fertilizer nitrogen costs, which is very pertinent at the moment. We can get very high yields of silage off the outblocks, and I'll go into that during the presentation. And I think it fits in with the new cap where there's this requirement to lower fertilizer nitrogen use by 20%. Because we've lower fertilizer use, we'll also lower carbon footprint. Same reason we lower ammonia emissions. And whereas, say, white clover in the grazing system won't give us a reduction in nitrate leaching, if we're using red clover in this way in a multi-cut silage system, in a cut and carry type scenario, we can expect very low nitrate leaching under this type of management where all of the nutrients will be taken up by the crop ends up in the silage pit, fed to cows indoors, the slurry is collected and applied back out to the outblock. And if that slurry is well managed, we could expect very, very low nutrient losses from this crop. So there's a lot of positives there from an environmental point of view. And in terms of opportunity, there's the possibility of using it in grazing swards as well. That's something that we've been trying out for the last few years, and we're very pleased with it. In terms of the weaknesses, poor persistency is the big concern. Crop might only last maybe 3 or 4 years. And then, of course, you have costs and risks, of course, associated with regular reseeding. And we'll try to talk about how we might manage around that. Red clover is more difficult to ensile, so that you need to be a bit more careful around silage making. Stock control or our capacity is limited. And again, it's a matter of concern. I've already spoken about these two diseases, stem mealworm and sclerotinia. Another thing that comes up is that red clover has a high phytoestrogen content. That can affect the fertility of sheep during the breeding season, but it doesn't really have any effect on dairy cattle. If anything, it might have a positive impact. And then, of course, there's the risk of bloat under grazing. So, red clover, it's not all pluses. There are weaknesses as well that we need to be concerned about. Now, people will be more familiar with white clover in this country. And of course, red clover and white clover, they're both clovers. And from the point of view, they both have trifoliate leaves, and they also fix nitrogen. Both of them also fix nitrogen. But that's really where the similarities end. I'd often describe the growth habit of white clover. It's very much, if you see ivy growing up a wall, white clover grows along the surface of the ground in the same way as ivy grows up a wall, it grows in between the grass. The growing points are close to the ground and they're well protected from grazing and from animal hooves and that sort of thing. So white clover can be much more persistent. Red clover, I'd equate its growing habit to being more like a dock. And here's some more pictures here. It's a tap-rooted species like a dock. It has a erect growth habit. You can see here from this picture, it can grow up to 1 meter tall. And you have multiple shoots then growing out from a crown. And the risk is if any of these shoots get damaged or if the root get killed, that's the end of it. The plant has very limited capacity for vegetative regeneration. Whereas white clover has almost endless capacity. Red clover has very limited capacity. And that has a big bearing on the time frame of the crop. So in terms of the level of herbage production that we can expect from this crop, I suppose the best example of this is some work that was done in Grange between 2003 and 2007. And what we're looking at here is red clover with perennial ryegrass that received no nitrogen fertilizer. So you can see the red clover content and the ryegrass content. And that's compared then with perennial ryegrass receiving 600 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. Our own limited, they didn't want nitrogen fertilizer to be limiting in this study. And then it was conducted over 6 years. And the first thing you can see here is the very high level of herbage production from the red clover relative to the high nitrogen system and consistently over 6 years, which was a remarkable result when the expectation was that it wasn't going to last that long. The second thing that's important to note here is that there was a decline in the red clover content of the sward, and that's something that we can expect over time, which shortens the lifetime of the crop. And of course, the crop remained productive even with the red clover declining, partly because of this fertility, this build-up of fertility that we can expect. In terms of an overall comparison over the 6 years, the red clover grew marginally more grass than the perennial ryegrass with high nitrogen. A very positive result. We can expect very high production, no nitrogen fertilizer input, so it's a relatively cheap crop from that point of view. So the next big question then is if we're going sowing red clover, what cultivar should we be looking at? And I think the best source of information for this is from Northern Ireland. We don't have a recommended list in this country. This is work that was done around 10 years ago now. I don't think there's a newer list, or at least I haven't been able to find one. And these are the type of varieties that were tested. And again, you can see these are 3 full production years. You can see high levels of production in Northern Ireland, and the type of varieties that were used. Now, Merviet is a variety that we used back in the 90s in some work, and it was also one of the varieties used in the Grange work, and was considered an old enough variety at that time. So these are some of the more recent varieties that have come on the market. Another good source of information is the recommended list for England and Wales. And we see the same type of cultivars coming up here. Then we see a list of other ones, and we can see this one here, Berga, which is a red clover variety that has been bred by Patrick Conahan in Oak Park. And if we look at it in terms of yield, it performs very well. And also in terms of, probably just even more importantly, in terms of persistency, it scores very well in terms of persistence. And I think persistence is a very important trait, and it was bred for that. And I guess this is a variety that we need to keep an eye on for the future. I don't think it's going to be available this year. That really will be available commercially in 2023. I have seen different mixes that people have been using, and I just put up a word of warning there that some of the red clover you'll see in some of the mixtures, when they wouldn't be on either of the above lists that I showed. And when you look up about them, then you find that they're recommended for use in continental or in Nordic environments, which isn't really appropriate for our conditions here. Now, I'm not saying that they're bad varieties. We just have no information on them. Really, what these would be the varieties that we're happy to recommend, and they're varieties suitable for the temperate type of environment that we're working at in this country. The next thing is seeding rates. If we pick a variety, what seeding rate do we go on with? And one thing to note, I find out a number of differences between red clover and white clover. And another big difference is the size of the seed. Red clover seed is far bigger than the seed of white clover. And that's something that you need to take into account when it comes to seeding rates. So these are examples of 2 different mixtures for 2 different situations. This is a short-term type mixture we've used in Solohead with a hybrid ryegrass, 9 kilos, 4 kilos of white clover, 4 kilos of red clover, 1 kilo of white clover. And this would be more suitable for a shorter term situation. This mix here, 2 perennial ryegrasses, heading dates in mid to late May, 4 kilos of each, 4 kilos of red clover and 1 kilo of white clover. And this would be for a longer term, more persistent type of mix that we'd hope would last for maybe 10 years. Because white clover is much more persistent than red clover, and we'd always recommend putting white clover into the mix. So the expectation is something along the lines here that as the red clover is dominant after reseeding, very high production for the first 4 or 5 years, and then that will start to die out of the sward over time. And then the white clover will start to come into the sward more and more over time. And of course, the white clover then can be topped up with oversowing if necessary to maintain a productive sward over a 10-year period, because we want to keep down the cost of reseeding. And also, if the red clover dies out, well, that gives us a disease break here towards the end of the life cycle of that particular crop of forage. Question that often comes up then is about oversowing red clover. You know, we're familiar with the idea of oversowing white clover, and that can be problematical enough, but I would have concerns about oversowing red clover. I suppose the first one is that the seed size is so much larger. So if you're putting on, say, 2 kilos of white clover seed, you're putting on around 3 million seeds per acre. with red clover at the same rate, you put out only 1 million seeds. And if we're hoping that the seeds will come in contact with spaces in the sward where they'll get a chance to germinate, you have a much higher probability with white clover than with red clover, unless of course we up the rate of seeding of red clover, which is feasible as well. And we can see these seedlings coming through. The second concern I have is that red clover doesn't produce stolons in the same way as white clover. So if a white clover seedling gets established here, it gets established in the sward, next thing that can start to grow out, spread out, and it could spread maybe up to 1 meter per year. Whereas red clover, if that seedling gets established, that's it. It doesn't really have any capacity to spread. So that's a limitation. And the third thing with oversowing is how you manage it afterwards is very important in terms of grazing out tight, allowing plenty of light down to the seedlings. And if you're trying to grow red clover in the multi-cut silage system, you don't really have that opportunity. So for the most part, we'd be strongly recommending that if you're putting in red clover, that you put it in as a full reseed. Making silage. Now this is something that was looked at in Grange. Their conclusion was that an earlier harvesting schedule increases both herbage production and the persistence of red clover. So when we talk about earlier harvesting schedule, what we're really talking about there is taking off the first cut sometime in mid to late May, as opposed to say early June, for example. That the earlier harvesting schedule works better, so starting in mid-May and really then taking off cuts maybe every 6, 7, 8 weeks afterwards. So this is the schedule that worked best in Grange, taking first cut in late May, mid-July, 1st September, and then a late cut in November, December. This is a schedule we used in Solohead last year. We grazed it in the spring. It's not something we're going to do again, but under the circumstances. We had planned to take off the cut in around the 15th of May, but we got very wet weather conditions during May last year, and really it was the June bank holiday weekend before we got the first cut. We want to avoid cutting the crop under wet conditions because we want to avoid damage, but also we need to get a good wilt in the crop, and I'll say more about that. Second cut in mid-July, similar yields to Grange. You can see third cut in, we took it slightly earlier in end of August because we wanted to do some drainage work in the field. And then we got a good cut there in mid-November. And I think it's one of the problems with managing outblocks, particularly where you can't get livestock to the outblock, is how you manage. Like if you take off a cut in early September, you can still accumulate an awful lot of grass by the middle of October, and if you don't, that needs to be managed, otherwise it'll rot. And we've seen situations where we had maybe 2 tons, 2.5 tons of cover built up on a sward mid-October on an outblock, and maybe that's down to 1.5 tons by December because it just rots away. In terms of digestibility, say comparing red clover with perennial ryegrass, lower digestibility. That's another way in which red clover is different to white clover. White clover tends to have higher digestibility. Similar enough group protein, lower than the ryegrass. Big concern here is the much lower water-soluble carbohydrates, which is substrate for fermentation, and also a higher buffering capacity, which makes it more difficult to ensile it. It makes it more difficult to drop the pH of the crop. And if we look a bit more deeper into that, we can see consistently across 3 cuts, 4 cuts, lower digestibility, group protein lower in the first cut, second cut, not so much in the third cut. And then very low water-soluble carbohydrates, particularly during the second and third cuts when there's a lot of clover in the swards, and higher buffering capacity. And I think if we had looked at these figures before we had starting growing red clover, we would maybe have thought twice about it. But the reality is, in practical reality, we've had no difficulty making good silage off these swards. So the implications of this is that it's more difficult to ensile, so we need to wilt or use an effective preservative. 48-hour wilt works very well in Solohead, so that's part of the reason we're watching the weather forecast, and weather forecast now is really accurate, so very reliable. So what we do is we cut it, spread it out, wilt it for 48 hours, roll it in, bale it up. Third cut can be risky, and there's no hope of ensiling the fourth cut in November. As I was saying, you can build up high covers in October, November, and there is a real risk of senescence, so we need to harvest that. The approach that we're taking in Solohead is to zero graze. You also have the option maybe of grazing with heifers or other young stock. put some work in Northern Ireland would say that that does shorten the lifetime of the sward. So what we're really trying to do is to stick with minimal damage using the zero grazer. So this is our planned harvesting schedule, starting 15th to 20th of May, which we shown to work best in Grange. Then early to mid-July, and a third cut. We may be able to even fit a fourth cut into it before the end of September. I think that's something worth looking at, but this is the kind of recommended schedule we could go with. And then in November, we'll zero graze. We have to zero graze maybe 2 cuts in the autumn, depending on the weather conditions. This is the analysis of the first cut silage in Solohead in 2021. This is first cut red clover, very high dry matter. We'd normally wilt all the silage, so we'd normally be 40% dry matter plus. pH is good for that type of dry matter, low ammonia, ash, so there's very low contamination of this sward. NDF is more or less on target. DMD is reasonably good. Low 70s is typically the silage that we make in Solohead and similar with the UFL. And I suppose clover is normally associated with higher crude protein. In this case, crude protein was low. But if you take this silage overall, you'll be very happy with it. In terms of the zero grazing, this is Solohead late November. It's down by the river, so it's a wet place now. Conditions were good. This is the type of crop we were cutting. You will notice when you look at the material being put into the cows here that there is a fair amount of senescent material in it. And I think our plan this year is we'll run one system at 3.5 cows per hectare, and they'll have to be housed up earlier because of the short growing season or because of the higher stocking rate. And we'll zero graze in that grass starting maybe late October and make better use of it and avoid the senescence that's so we need to be concerned about. In terms of the feeding value then of red clover silage, like the digestibilities are only, say, adequate, but there's more to feeding value than just digestibility. And with clover, what you have is a higher rate of particle size breakdown and outflow through the system. And if we think about the digestive system of a cow as a bit like an industrial process, like if the material can pass through the process quicker, it can be used more quickly. And that's really what's happening here. It's lower digestibility, but it passes through the system more quickly, and this gives us higher intake. So if we said red clover silage versus perennial ryegrass silage, you might have 10% lower digestibility, but 10% higher intake. The higher intake compensates them for lower digestibility. And that's something we clearly see in Solohead because the cows really go mad for the red clover silage. You know, if it's well made and it's good and dry, they go mad for it. They really lick it up. So they can perform very well on it once allowances are not restricted. And of course, with dry cows, there's also the possibility of restricting allowances to avoid them getting too fat over the winter. Now, soil fertility is very important. You think, say, with red clover, it's got this capacity to fix a lot of nitrogen, to build fertility in soils. But also we have to pay much closer attention to soil fertility, other aspects of it. The first thing to think about is nitrogen fertilizer and the productivity. And this is the average of 6 years in Grange. In one set of plots, they put on no fertilizer nitrogen. On the other set, they put on 50 kilos in the spring. And what they found was that they had higher production, significantly higher production with no nitrogen compared to where they put nitrogen on. And really what was happening was that the nitrogen was causing a depression of the red clover content of the sward and less fixation. Where there's no nitrogen putting on, they had higher red clover contents, which of course is important for the persistence of the sward. When we look at Solohead, in a crop established in 2019, 2 years of data, we see similar enough herbage production to Grange. So we can see that on a number of different sites across the island of Ireland. And again, where we put on 0 and 65 kilos of nitrogen, again, lower herbage production with the nitrogen, where does nitrogen go into the system because it's depressing the red clover content of the sward. And I think there's a key lesson there. In terms of lime P and K, we need to apply lime to bring the pH up to 6.5. Nitrogen fixation is a biological process, so we need to be close to neutrality in terms of pH to facilitate that. This crop is if we're growing 15 tons of dry matter per hectare, it has a very high requirement for K, and tap-rooted crops like red clover have a high requirement for K. So we're typically taking off around 375 kilos K per hectare per year, which is 300 units per acre. I could say to apply P and K in line with soil test results, which of course is important if the soil tests are high. Generally speaking, what we see on outblocks is that generally those soils are quite depleted, tend to be index 1 soils. And under those type of conditions, index 1 or 2, what we recommend is putting on 25 kilos of K and 3 kilos of P for every ton of dry matter expected in the next harvest. So for example, if we expect to take off 5 tons of dry matter in the first cut, we need to put on 125 kilos of K, which is 100 units of K, or 15 kilos of P, which is 5 tons by 3, 12 units per acre. And this can be put on either as organic manure or as mineral fertilizer. And if we take 1,000 gallons of slurry, and of course the content of that can be very variable, but if there's this type of constituents would be typical, 3,000 gallons of this would meet our requirement for the first cut. But over the course of the year, over maybe the course of 4 cuts, we will need to go in with some fertilizer K in particular. Now the thing about this crop is that it'll take up all the nutrients that are available. So there is a risk of luxury uptake of K if the crop doesn't perform to expectation, or maybe a combination of fertilizer and slurry and there's an excess of K put on. And there is a risk of high K silage and the associated risk then of milk fever, and it's something to bear in mind. Of course, if you consider cutting back on K to avoid milk fever, there's a real risk that will shorten the longevity of the sward. So there's a kind of a balance that has to be hit there. In terms of what we do in Solohead, we'll test all the silages for K as part of the tests that we'll do, and we'll avoid feeding any high K silages. You know, we'll save that until after the cows have calved. And then in terms of nitrogen fertilizer, it does more harm than good. So not applying nitrogen fertilizer is not necessary. It's only adding costs with no benefit. Another big thing that can have a big influence on the longevity of these swards is docks. Like there are dock sprays like Prospect and Eagle, which are not particularly effective. And really the concern is that the conditions that are suitable for red clover, which is a taprooted species, is also favorable for docks. So if we think about high K situations, long rotations between cuts, you know, maybe minimum number of cuts per year, these are conditions that work for red clover, but they're also very suitable for docks. And really the best time to control docks is during reseeding, and we've recently published some work on this, that where if you can get good control during reseeding, that will last for the 10 years of the crop. So really it's a matter of putting on your herbicide after reseeding. You see some young docks establishing here. We can see young clovers. When they first come up, they produce this shovel-shaped leaf. Now, if you spray at this stage, you'll kill the docks, but you'll also kill the clover, so it's too early. And they also say that you shouldn't allow the dock to become bigger than a dock leaf here, to become bigger than the size of a €2 coin. So there is a bit of a timing issue. And if you take, say, April this year, for example, we've got a very cold April, cold and dry. Crops were very slow to establish. But it was maybe 8 or 9 weeks after sowing that we actually went in and sprayed. If you do it under other conditions, it could be after 6 weeks. So there's no real time that you can say. Really, you have to look at the crop, make sure that the white clover is well developed, or the red clover is well developed with full trifoliate leaves, and gone past this stage with the shovel-shaped leaf. And here's a picture of a crop after spraying. And you can see the docks are after being hit. You can see the brown coming in on the leaves there. And you can see how well developed the red clover is at that stage. There's a limit on the herbicides that we can use, post-emergence herbicides. These were available subject to derogation last year. We hope that they'll be available again this year under that same derogation. It's important to make sure that they're clover safe and that they're suitable for red and white clover, and to get the timing right. Because what can happen with docks is, you know, you'll reseed. If you don't spray, you won't really see the problem for the first couple of years. Then after year 3 or 4, docks will really start to come into the sward. Conditions really suit them very well. And next thing they'll take over and destroy the sward, and you're back in reseeding after 4 or 5 years. So it's very important to get that right.
James, we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, this is the last topic now, Mark. It's red clover for grazing. And these are the type of mixes we're using. 2 perennial ryegrasses, 2 examples. Perennial ryegrass, 10 kilos, 2 kilos of red clover in both mixes, 2 kilos of white clover. So a slightly different mix to the silage mix. And we're finding this to be very beneficial. Put the red clover in there, it gives us good production for the first couple of years. And again, as the red clover dies out, it'll die out more quickly under these circumstances. We get the white clover becoming dominant, and it gives us a disease break. So then to draw some conclusions in terms of herbage production and longevity, we can get high herbage production under a multi-cut system. We're talking close to 15 tons of dry matter per hectare per year, which is very good, very cost effective if we can maintain it over a long time period. And how do we improve longevity? First of all, no nitrogen fertilizer, it's not necessary. Secondly, adequate K fertilization. Avoid damage by machinery and animal hooves during wet weather. In that regard, say we'll put on slurry using the umbilical system, take off silage. We mainly make bales. We avoid heavy machinery, and as I said, we're going to zero graze as opposed to graze in the autumn. And post-emergent stock control is absolutely vital when reseeding. Lime, of course, is also important, and lime is important then for nitrogen fixation. In terms of making silage, what we recommend is starting, say, 15 to 20 to May and having perennial ryegrass varieties that match with that, then cutting 6 or 7 week intervals afterwards. Question that often comes up about is the cutting height, and we'd say there's no need to adjust that when you go out and measure cutting height of a lot of mowers, they come in at 5 or 6 centimeters anyway. 48-hour wilt is very important, or use an effective preservative. In our case, that would be using molasses. And the high intake then compensates for lower digestibility. When it comes to reseeding, choose a cultivar off the UK recommended list, Northern Ireland preferably. These are kind of ones that we're happy with, that we know something about. In an acre pack then, we're talking about 3 to 4 kilos of red clover, 6 to 9 kilos of ryegrass. That'll depend on whether it's perennial ryegrass, tetraploid, diploid, or whether it's a hybrid ryegrass, and then 1 kilo of white clover. And post-emergent stock control, it's absolutely vital. You get one opportunity, don't miss it. In terms of stem mealworm and sclerotinia, I think the risk is low for the time being. I think it's something we need to be conscious of for the future. And it's a good idea to plan to have a four-year break between crops of red clover and then select disease-resistant cultivars. Other questions that come up a lot are, on an outblock, should you grow maize or red clover? I think if the ground is good enough for maize, you should grow maize. You have the cost of sowing down every year, but you only have one silage harvest per year. Of course, the other way you could look at this question, it should be not red clover versus maize, but red clover and maize, where you grow. It's very common on the continent to grow red clover for 3 or 4 years and then put in a maize crop for maybe 3 years. Phytoestrogens, it's a concern for sheep. It's not an issue with dairy cattle. And then bloat can be a problem under grazing, but it's not when you're feeding silage. It's not an issue at all, really. And then the other big question, of course, is oversowing red clover. And I just put out a word of warning that it's not the same as oversowing white clover. And if you've had problems with oversowing white clover, it's not going to be better with red clover. But that's it, Mark.
Thanks, James. You covered a lot there in a short space of time, and just we will be putting the slides up on our website later on today, just if you want to get some of the facts and figures that are included there, because you provided some very useful data there showing the difference between Grange and Solohead. And just maybe, I see we have a few farmers online today. It'd be interesting to see, are there any farmers out there that have tried red clover? Just interested to get what your experience has been. I see one farmer has sown red clover and is quite happy with the results. He sowed it in August 2020, and was pleased with his performance in 2021. Now, he did say he used reduced chemical N, which he probably didn't need to use, really. And his question was, should I try applying zero chemical N this year? I imagine your advice would be?
Without question. white clover has some tolerance, but it seems red clover is very intolerant of nitrogen fertilizer. As I said, it does more harm than good. And it's not only the evidence from Ireland. If we look internationally as well, it's that contention is well supported.
And James, would you be advising people to even experiment with this? We know that multi-species swards is becoming quite popular, and people are trying it out and giving it a go. I mean, is that something you'd recommend with red clover as an option?
I think the similarities in the way that multi-species sward and red clover have received a lot of interest, that people are interested in and are trying it. I think the similarities, because red clover is an important component of multi-species sward. So some of the concerns are raised there about red clover. We also need to be concerned with multi-species sward. If we're going to grow, say, red clover continuously, are we going to end up with these disease risks? I think I'd leave it up to people themselves. I know that organic farmers have a good bit of experience with growing this crop, and
yeah,
I've seen high levels of production out on organic farms. Commercial farmers as well, less so, but it seems that interest seems to be growing.
And does that dock issue, is that an issue for organic farmers, or how do they manage that?
I can't answer how they manage it, but I know, again, looking at the literature, docks are a big problem on organic farms. You know, that the dock will always be with us.
On strong arms. Pat, there's a lot of questions coming, a lot of huge interest in this topic, particularly around varieties and the availability of seed. I presume a lot of the major seed companies that James seed is readily available with those varieties that you spoke about.
My understanding is that there isn't an issue with seed availability. Like, the concern is that there has been a growth and interest in using white clover and red clover, and you know, with problems with containers moving around the world, and a lot of the seed is grown in New Zealand. Is it something that we need to be concerned about? And I put this question to the seed companies, and they said it's not anything that we should be concerned about, that they should be able to get plenty of seed. So the last thing I want to do is contribute to some sort of rush. There doesn't seem to be an issue around that.
Yeah, a huge question. There's one in there in relation to, I suppose, a balancing question between the reduction in the potential greenhouse gas emissions from the reduced nitrogen versus, I suppose, the increased potential loss of soil carbon from cultivation. Have you any figures on that, or any?
Well, yeah, we've been measuring soil carbon in Solohead now for 20 years. And I think one of the reasons we've kind of locked on to this idea of a 10-year interval is that we lose a lot of carbon during cultivation for reseeding, but if we can hold that interval to around more than 8 years, we regain that carbon. So if it's 8 to 10-year interval, we're talking about carbon neutral reseeding. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we lose carbon, we could lose, I think it's 100 tons of carbon dioxide or 30 tons of carbon in a matter of 24 hours, but we can gain that back then over 10 years. If we had to reseed more frequently, say if we were growing red clover in rotation with maize, which of course maize wouldn't grow at all in Solohead, there's more of a concern there. And I guess, you know, that's why there's soil testing for carbon on tillage farms. That's more of a tillage type scenario. But in a permanent grassland, if you put it in as a 10-year crop, which economically that's really what you need to be thinking about, I wouldn't be concerned about soil carbon in that case.
Okay. The question in relation to, you talked about the 10-year cycle with a shift from red clover towards white clover. Are you still talking about that being a cut crop, or is it a shift to grazed in the latter stages? No,
so I've got two scenarios there, but really the main focus of the talk was on an external block of ground, that a stockless situation where you're cutting it 4 or 5 times per year. Yeah. So if the red clover dies out, and it won't just all die out overnight, it'll die out, you know, the crop just gets thinner and thinner. and then the white clover will start to take over more and more. Now, as we come towards the end of that cycle, we may be growing closer to 12, 13 tons with a mainly white clover type sward. Then we'll be growing, say, 15 tons, maybe early or in middle of the cycle. And of course, even if the white clover became problematical, there's also the option of just going in with nitrogen fertilizer, you know. But I think, you know, I think the thing can be run, and we've looked at this as well. You know, you can still grow high yields with white clover if the red clover dies out.
Okay.
And of course, you also have the option of oversowing the white clover if necessary.
I think you've clarified it there. There was a question: is what's an outblock? But I think you've clarified what you mean there. A couple of questions relate to the other potential benefits, and a question there in relation to the fact that it's more of a taproot that you're talking about, and does that lead to improved soil health, tackling compaction and any other issues? And I suppose the other issue there is it more or less drought proof than or drought resistant than a perennial ryegrass crop?
Well, okay, so it's tap rooted, so it has a deep tap root. But like if you take ryegrass, perennial ryegrass has a much finer root system, and it can be very deep. And if we look at the root volumes of red clover, you have this big taproot and everything else, but if we go into those type of swards, we'll find that the ryegrass content of the root volume is maybe 85%. So you have never underestimate like ryegrass is extremely competitive for nutrients, massive capacity, and personally, I don't think these rooted crops, these deep rooted crops, necessarily give us improved drought resistance. That's just my own concern. And like in Solohead, it's a wet farm. We have a shallow water table. We still suffer from drought, say in years like 2018.
We have a comment here, James, from a sheep farmer in Scotland who's joining us this morning, and she's saying that she has used red clover for the last 20 years, having seen it on organic farms, and she says it makes awesome silage for the ewes, high intake, and reduces the need for concentrate pre-lambing, and then graze ewes and lambs before May, shut off for silage, then 2 cuts, then finish the last of the lambs in September, October. She says it's a no-brainer. You learn to love the docks, and they have high tannins, so they do have some value. And sheep grazing also helps keep them under control. So that's a very positive experience there from our farmer in Scotland. So it's great to get that feedback. Some questions there, James, around the percentage. What percentage of the farm would you recommend a farmer to in year 1 to try out reseeding red clover?
I think that was the thing that really worried me at the open day. One farmer was talking about putting in 60 or 70 acres of red clover, which is an awful leap of faith. You think about the costs. So I'd be kind of saying to go at this one step at a time. And of course, there's a cost of reseeding that amount of ground, but you know, to build up experience of it before, you know, going all in. Yeah. That's not a direct answer to the question, because, you know, but it's yeah. I'll leave it at that.
Slightly unrelated to clover, but the question here is, why would maize not grow at Solohead, or have you tried it?
Well, we haven't tried it. Fertility-wise mightn't be a problem. The real concern we'd have is getting it to harvest it. Like Solohead is a wet farm. We've a shallow water table. We've got quite an impermeable subsoil. So if we get wet conditions, we'd be really in a right mess trying to get the crop out in October, November. You know, that's the real problem.
And just one more comment for another farmer. It says, great work, James, oversowing red clover on 2-cut silage system, producing excellent silage quality and quantity, and very good weight gains when grazed with young stock. So another positive remark. Pat, more questions coming through there.
Yeah, I know that people can kind of stitch in red clover. Like we've seen a lot of problems with oversowing white clover, so we have to be even more concerned about it when it comes to red clover. I'm not saying it doesn't work, just to be a bit more wary. That's all. Sorry, Pat.
Yeah, I suppose back to alternative issues. There's a few questions in there about whether it's pollinator friendly or whether you're experiencing any increase in pollinators in the areas where there's red clover.
Like you go into a field in the month of July, and like it's often the question that comes up: should red clover be allowed to flower out in each year, and the first year in particular? And I'd say try stopping it flowering out, because you go into the field in July and it's just a mass of flowers and a mass of bees. Now it's relatively short term, so I don't know how beneficial it is. But if you're walking through a field in the month of July, you could have bees bouncing off your forehead, that's that kind of way. There's so many bees active in the crop. But I'm no expert on it.
Okay. There's a number of questions again, and I know you dealt with it a good bit in terms of the reseeding process, but there's a lot of questions coming in about it, so you might just go through what your recommendation is for reseeding.
So, like what we'll do in Solohead, and I just talked about what we'll do is we'll spray it.
What time of the year would that be, James?
Say, look, it could be any time of the year, but take off a crop of first cut, spray it as soon as it greens up with glyphosate. We'd cultivate that after a week or so with a disc harrow. 2 runs of disc harrow, different directions, and then go in straight away with one pass system, seed box on top of a power harrow, and just sow it in. And I think there was a picture of that there on the thing. Then we'll put on 10-10-20. We normally put on dung actually between cultivating, between burning off and cultivating. We'll normally go on with dung. After the crop starts to come up, then we'll put on 10-10-20. Fairly soon after we put in the crop as well, after sowing it, the ground conditions are good enough, we'll go in with lime. It's a good opportunity to get on lime. After a few weeks, 10-10-20, then we're watching for the spraying. And that spraying could take place post-emergent herbicide anytime 6 to 9, 10 weeks after reseeding, depending on how quick the crop comes up. And that's about it. Regular P and K then, as I said, but other than the 10-10-20, 2 bags of 10-10-20 per acre after, just to get the crop up, there's no real need. I think one of the pictures I showed there showed a young red clover seedling with well-developed nodules on the roots. So you're fixing nitrogen very quickly.
Need that initial nitrogen just for establishment.
Just to get it up quickly, and again to try to keep down the weeds. The weeds, yeah. So it's pretty straightforward. It's like any reseed.
A question here, James. Why is it necessary to include such high quantity of grass and any white clover in the seed mix?
So when if you look at the work that was done in Grange, and I didn't go into it, but they used 4 kilos of perennial ryegrass per acre with 4 kilos of red clover, and they got very highly productive crops. When you look at the common mixes that are out there, they often contain twice as much perennial ryegrass as used in Grange. So I'd say there's some flexibility there around seeding rates. We could potentially go lower with the ryegrass. It's a good question. We could also maybe go a bit lower with the red clover. But look, they're the kind of mixes that are out there commercially available, and of course these are well tried and tested, so we won't ignore that either. Putting the white clover in, I think, is very important. Personally, I wouldn't do it without the white clover, because the white clover just fills out the crop a bit more. And as I said, as the red clover then begins to decline, you'll see the white clover coming into the crop more and more. And so why miss the opportunity to put it in? It can't do any harm.
There's a question there in relation to a potential for mixes of red clover and Italian ryegrass as opposed to a perennial.
Yeah, and again, you can. It's going to be a shorter term crop again, and to get higher yields again. And if you look at the kind of the maximum yield potential that you see in the literature, you're talking about 22 tons. That's been recorded under some circumstances, and also been recorded under farm conditions. Of course, the longevity of that crop then is going to be shorter unless you can maintain it. And I'm aware of people that are doing that, but again, that's very specialist. We'll take it one step at a time.
Questions in relation to performance of beef animals, but I presume there's no reason why the beef animals won't perform to the same level as the dairy.
Like, the concern I'd have, again, looking at the information, is that there's always an element when you're doing this comparison with, say, perennial ryegrass and red clover, that you're always going to be promoting the red clover and saying the red clover is fantastic and at massive growth rates and everything else. And I think our experience and the reality is that, like, red clover won't be any worse. If you see your silage analysis, you might be a small bit concerned that it doesn't look that great, which is obviously the case. But as I said, because of its higher intake characteristics, that compensates to some extent for the lower digestibility. So I suppose the come to a short answer about that is that they'll perform fine, but not necessarily better than ryegrass. I wouldn't oversell it, is what I'm trying to say, in terms of quality.
Comment coming in here, James, from an advisor up in Donegal. Excellent practical presentation, as usual, from James. With high chemical fertilizer dry stock farmer, they'll be looking at red clover as 70% of their fertilizer is applied to silage swards. So just we'll take that as a comment. The question there, James, in relation to other species, you know, we've spoken about multi-species swards a good deal over the last couple of years on the series. I mean, are there opportunities there to identify other companion species to go along with red clover?
Well, I think red clover is a key component of multi-species swards, and when you look at the how productive those swards can be, it's really the red and white clover are key components of that in terms of supplying nitrogen, fixing nitrogen. They're used under a low nitrogen situation. The big concern I have, and particularly for multi-cut silage, is that docks will take over, and there's a real risk of that. And like we've seen that if you don't get on top of the docks early in the cycle, at the seedling stage, by year 3 or 4, 5, you could have a right mess on your hands. You could have more docks than anything else, and that's the concern. Can we? I think there's going to be there is a question mark about the derogation for these post-emergence herbicides that we have available up till now. If we put in a multi-species, say chicory or plantain, or, you know, if we're limited in our capacity to control docks at the seedling stage, that's really the thing that I would be concerned about. And I've done a nice bit of work on docks as well over my career, so I have a bit of a thing against docks.
We'll be sending the school children out into the fields again, I suspect, in the next number of years, James. We're going to have to wrap it up at that, but huge interest, James, and lots of compliments on your presentation. So really, thank you very much for that. Really timely, of course, with the huge prices experienced in terms of fertilizer and nitrogen fertilizer. So hopefully people will get something from that, and maybe to have the confidence to try and maybe allocate portions of their farm into red clover. There seems to be a good experience there, anecdotally anyway, from today's session. So maybe talk to other farmers, or your farm advisor can access the knowledge base that's within Teagasc as well. So James, thanks very much for that, and Pat, thanks for helping with questions.
No problem.
And thank you everybody for your questions and tuning in today. Today's session is recorded, as I mentioned earlier on, and James's presentation will be available on the Teagasc website, as well as available as a podcast on the Signpost podcast on whichever platform you access. Next week, we'll be talking to Professor Jane Stout from the School of Natural Science in Trinity College, and she'll be talking about the valuing natural capital for the future. And I expect that Jane may have some comments to make on red clover as well, particularly from the biodiversity perspective. So until next week, thanks again for tuning in, and take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.